Talking about the uniqueness of the temple, we were discussing how there's a commandment to bring all of one's sacrifices to Beit HaBechira, the chosen place. I could have said the Mikdash, but in this case, the point was because the verse says, "Bring your sacrifices to the place that God shall choose." So Rambam calls it, whenever he's talking about this place, Beit HaMikdash, as opposed to any other place, he calls it Beit HaBechira. Okay. Uh, and I was actually surprised by this. Uh, it says concerning a bechor behema Torah, the Rambam says elsewhere, she'ein mivioto michutz laaretz. If he has the firstborn of a pure animal, it means a kosher animal, let's say a cow, firstborn calf of a cow, so is not supposed to be brought from chutz laaretz to Eretz Yisrael. And when he continues, kamo she'ein mivin dagam v'tirosh michutz laaretz. So too, the grain and wine used in sacrifice also only comes from Eretz Yisrael, not from abroad. And if he did bring the firstborn animal from Chutz La'aretz, so he waits until it develops a blemish, at which point it can now be consumed. It's no longer considered sacrificial, so it can be consumed. I have noticed myself here that even today, I heard this recently, so there's some scholars who don't understand what stood in Givon was a mikdash despite the common name Bama. I heard a shir recently. I heard this too often that because the word bama is used to describe what stood in Givon. He ha-bama ha-gadolah. It was the big bama, the great bama, as opposed to the regular bamot. Bamot meant what? By the time we get to the prophet Samuel, a bama was a private altar, and they were calling the mishkan that stood in Givon. They're calling that the bama gadolah. That was not a bama in the sense that it was a high place, so it was literally a bama, but it had nothing to do with the high places that were not literally high places, that were just private altars. Remember, high place literally means, bama literally means high place. But when we say that regular people had bamot, it isn't because they were literally high places, even though they could have put it on their rooftop. Normally a mizbeach is built on the ground, but in this case, put it on your roof, you could put it on the hill, but it didn't have to be. It could have been anywhere. And it was called a high place because that's where they would worship God. So bama was a backyard altar, let's say, a private altar. For whatever reason, in their colloquial language, they called what was at Givon the Bama Gedolah, even though it was the Mishkan, like the Rambam points out, and as you can infer from the sources in Zvachim, that was the Mishkan as it was built, as mentioned this week's parasha, under the authority of Moses. It was built by Betzalel and Oliav and other artisans, and it was exactly as it was. There was no difference for it. And as the Rambam says, it was actually Mikdash. Halachically speaking, that was the base of Mikdash at the time. The entire time King David was king, and even before he took the throne, that's where the entire sacrificial service on behalf of the people took place. That's where they did Korban Pesach, for example. And that people have been mistaken by this because it's called a bama, and they know that bama at the time referred to private altars. They consider this one also. They didn't understand that it was just a more special private altar. No, it had nothing to do with a private altar. It was a high place. As a matter of fact, I think that, as we pointed out before, this was the first time in history that the Mikdash, or the Mishkan, was specifically put at the top of a hill or at the top of a mountain. When the Israelites first erected the tabernacle, it was always in the center of their camp, not necessarily at any high point. Maybe it was even lower. And where they put it in the Gilgal also, the Gilgal is actually quite low lying. If maybe it's even below sea level, it's in the Jordan Valley somewhere. So it's not necessarily anywhere high. And you go to the place where the Mishkan stood in Shilo, and you also see it's not necessarily a high place. As a matter of fact, it's surrounded by many other hills. It's almost like in a bowl. And it's not the lowest part in the bowl, but it's certainly not a high place. And also, as far as we could tell, where it stood in Nov was not noticeably higher than the surroundings. Whereas where it was in Givon was the first time they put it at a peak. So that it rightfully was called a high place, the Bama Gedolah, the great high place. But it had nothing to do with the Bamoth that are mentioned elsewhere throughout Tanakh as being private altars that were once permitted and then became prohibited. And even when they were prohibited, people continued using them because that was their habit. So we should clarify these things. Let's look into the second halacha. Hamakriv korban chutz la'azara bitel mitzmaraseh levar al lo taseh. One who offers a sacrifice outside of the temple courtyard has uh, negated or is abrogated. He has not fulfilled a positive commandment and has also violated a negative commandment. He didn't do the thou shalt, and he violated the thou shalt not. As it says, he shamer lecha pentale olothecha b'chol makom asher tireh. Be you warned. Watch out. Do not elevate. Literally, it means elevate your burnt offerings any place asher tireh that you see, or in this case, tireh is your own choosing. You can't just offer your sacrifices wherever you want. And if a person did so wantonly, that means he had been warned by witnesses, hey, don't offer a sacrifice here. This isn't the temple courtyard. He is liable to excision. As it says, Asher yaleh o lo zavach, lo petach o moed lo yavienu, la asotho lashem, v'nichraf me'amel. Okay, so this is in HaKorbanot. He says he has this sacrifice. He's going to offer a burnt offering or a feast offering, and what happens? He didn't bring it to the entrance of the tent of meeting. Petach ol moed doesn't literally mean the entrance. Nothing was actually done at the entrance. Petach ol moed, or the mizbeach asher petach ol moed at the entrance, is always referring to what the tabernacle or the temple courtyard. And by the way, if we're dealing with the regular sacrifices, not let's say it's not a burnt offering or a sin offering or a guilt offering. Let's say it's just a shlamim or a pesach. He can offer it throughout the courtyard. He can offer it right at the eastern gate of the courtyard, which is the farthest point from the entrance to the Ol Moed. Or he can offer it behind the Ol Moed or on the sides of the Ol Moed. The courtyard in the tabernacle, as we read once again in this week's annual parsha, at least, was 50 by 100 amos surrounding the tent of meeting. And all of that is halachically petach Ol Moed, the entranceway of the tent of meeting. Okay? And read Haggadah Pesach to see the significance of this according to Onkelos and the Zohar. So he has to offer sacrifice at the entranceway of the tent of meeting, which is biblical idiom describing the courtyard. And just like the first Mishkan had just one courtyard, it was surrounded by what's called the klaim, which were simple linen curtains held up by poles around the courtyard. That's what defined it. It wasn't a really fortified type of wall you had. In the temple, it was an actual wall, and there were other courtyards, but none of those were halachically courtyard. Even though it's mentioned a few times as Tanakh, there was a second courtyard, what we call the women's courtyard. None of the sacrifices are offered there. That's not a halachic place. So if a person were to bring such sacrifice unwittingly, that means beyond the Azarah, so he would be liable to bring this type of chatat, this sin offering, to atone for what he has done. So I pointed out here that yes, petach means azara, and this also means, I saw in the midrash, like we say every Passover, this also means that sometimes the doorway acts as an altar. Where did we see this? In Egypt, as I'll say. There was no altars in Egypt. They had a Korban Pesach like thing, but where did they burn it? Well, they ate most of it. What did they do with the blood? Normally, the blood has to be brought to the altar and applied to the altar. Each korban its own way. We saw some are splashed on, some are poured onto the altar, some are applied to the altar. If it's a burnt offering, it's squeezed onto the altar. What was the ceremonial application of the Pesach's blood in Egypt? And what was the answer? It was put on the doorposts. And therefore, when we see that Abraham and Sarah were also at Petach HaOhel, when they greeted God's emissaries who brought good tidings, also some tidings of the destruction of Sodom, was that good or not? It wasn't good for Abraham. He tried to talk God out of it. It means that they were standing basically outside their house where they had an altar, because wherever Abraham went and he pitched his tent, he built an altar and called out in the name of God. What does it mean? It means he prayed to God. He also preached. So when Abraham and Sarah were at the entranceway of their tent, it means they were engaged in prayer and sacrifice and preaching where they had their altar. And I guess you could say it's called a petach because it's an opening to another world. It's a connection. It's the closest thing we have to a physical manifestation of the divine. You go to the temple. Kind of weird. The prophet Isaiah he includes his own book with God saying, the the heavens are my throne, the earth is my footstool. What kind of house are you going to build for me? That was last week's Haftarah. You can build a house for God? What does that even mean? The whole world is full of his glory. Can you confine God, so to speak? No. But this is a place where we can go and interact with him. And that's also this week's Parsha. Moshe Rabbeinu was told, Oel Moed, that's where God is actually going to summon his word to speak to Moses and the other prophets, if they are worthy. You build this tabernacle, and you could actually have a place where, unlike in, let's say, a synagogue, we talk to God. We at least attempt to talk to God. We offer our hearts and our prayers, but more often than not, we don't hear him talking back to us. But if you do this properly, if you build the proper Mishkan, then you hear God talk back. And that's an amazing thing. Who could imagine that there would be a key, maybe this divine system, these tools to allow us to hear God? But that's what this week's Parsha is all about. There's a way to do it, just like Abraham did it. Okay, and that's why everything has to be done in the temple courtyard. So too, someone who slaughters sacrificial foods outside of the temple courtyard, even if he didn't put them up on the altar. In this case, halah sometimes means lifting them onto the altar. There, you have to go up on a ramp. By the way, the temple's ramp that led up to the altar is not mentioned at all in the book of Exodus. I couldn't find it anywhere in Tanakh, really. It's assumed by Chazal because you can't make steps to get up to the altar, and the altar eventually was 10 amos high, according to some Tanaim, whereas in the Mishkan it was only 3 amos high, so maybe they didn't need a ramp initially. And even if they did, so it was a low ramp. And according to the way the halachas decided, I know you could decide a historical question, said even in the tabernacle, the altar was 10 amos high, it was 5 by 5 square from a bird's eye view. That's actually just quite tall. It'd be a precipitous climb to get up there. It also had a ramp. The ramp is a necessity. You can't get up there without by a ladder or by steps. That's forbidden. So it must have been there was a ramp. But the ramp and its construction are never described in the biblical texts, interestingly enough. And also how to build the ramp. There's so much detail put into how to build the Mizbeach. The Gemara has a key to how to do it, the wooden mold and using the rocks and pouring in the lime and then painting it. But very little attention is actually given to the construction of the altar's ramp. So halah means either bring it up onto the altar or actually burning it. Okay, that's why it's called an elevation offering. It was entirely burnt. So even though we didn't burn any of the sacrificial parts on this altar, okay, he just slaughtered it. If he was doing this on purpose, he had been warned not to. He's also liable to excision. Shnemar, Asher, Yishat, Shor, Ochesev, Oez, and leave out part of the pasuk. Anybody who slaughters an ox or a sheep or a goat, these are the 3 species, by the way, that of animal that are used for sacrifice. Dam yechashev laishahu. So that will be considered blood. What does that mean? We'll read Rashi. We'll read some commentaries about this. Dam shafach v'nichra. That means it's considered blood, and he spilled blood. Normally, dam shafach is already, as it was in Genesis, bloodshed refers to murder. And even in other languages, like in English, dam shafach means it's like bloodshed, like murder. So you would think that that's what this means. If you don't have the tradition, the verse is saying that if someone slaughters an animal, a sacrificial animal he's not supposed to, dam yechashiv. This first dam usually means like demehem bam. He's liable. It's his own fault. Now he's going to pay the price. And dam shafach for committing murder, and he shall be cut off. So his punishment is excision, kareth. Shachat b'shogeg. But if he slaughtered unwittingly, he hadn't been warned, or maybe didn't know what he was doing, so he is also to bring maybe chatat kvua, a sin offering of fixed value. So what does Rashi say? Rashi brings the tradition here. That doesn't mean he committed murder. It doesn't mean that he killed a person even. It means that the perpetrator should pay with his life. Okay, he's liable. Remember, we said kareth means he's cut off from life in the next world. So dam shafach is a reference to what? Spilling the animal's blood. This is spilled blood because the animal's blood was supposed to be saved and used properly on the altar. Okay, so this was a sin because he did it beyond the azara and he didn't apply it to the altar properly. It's as though he spilled the animal's blood in an improper way. Remember, if he had spilled a person's blood, then he should have been put to death, like we see elsewhere in Tanakh. And if it was just killing his own animal, let's say for the purposes of chulin, eating non-sacrificial meat like we do every week, so it wouldn't be considered bloodshed. You're allowed to kill animals in order to eat them. So the tradition says that here, dam shafach means he spilled the animal's blood in an improper ritual manner. Okay, so next time you read this in Sefer Vayikra, when we're going to read this, well, this is the one chapter of Achremos that's not read on Yom Kippur. We read about the Yom Kippur service in the morning and the Arayos in the afternoon. The middle section, which is what we're discussing now, isn't read on Yom Kippur, so we have to wait for the annual or triannual reading of Achremos to get to this. And even then, I think this is actually Achremos, if I'm not mistaken, according to the triennial cycle. What we know as Achremos is divided into three. So this would be the second of those two readings. So we don't get to analyze this that often. And because this is a sugya related to sacrifice, it's also mostly ignored. And because it's ignored, it is basically, ignored actively. And because it's ignored actively, people are ignorant of it passively. So it's a problem. We have to fix this. Okay, let's move on here. Where is the divine warning? Don't do this. Don't slaughter sacrifices beyond the temple courtyard. Behekesh, a connection through the psukim. Shneimar, what does it say? Sham tale ulothecha. It says in Deuteronomy, in Parshath Re'eh, it says, there, it's talking about the temple, the chosen place, there shall you elevate your burnt offerings. And then it says, and there you shall do everything I have commanded you. Okay? So I think that they corrected this. The word kol in the Torah and throughout Tanakh never has a vav. That's Machon Mamre's edition. In the Korean version I'm using over here, apparently Rambam added a kaf, kichol, which is apparently incorrect because that's not the way it is in the Torah. Maybe that's just a typo in the Rambam, but they're mentioning that the Rambam had the wrong text over here. This elevating, this act of elevation, bachutz, beyond the temple, he's punished for it. He's here ferush. He was warned about this. Okay? God warned us about this explicitly, as it says, be warned. Do not elevate your burnt offerings. It says also beyond the temple. So too, making the offering, and we're going to see that this is a loaded word, asiyah, la'asot, includes the slaughter, and therefore it says there's a punishment for this ritual slaughter. Therefore, he is also warned against doing it. Shilo anashakatuv elen kain he's here. He's here. There's the biblical verse can only prescribe a punishment for something that he's been warned not to do. What is this? There's a pinuch over here. It says that people don't say that it is their choice to sin and accept the consequences. Okay, you have to make sure not to do this. Why is there an azhara? Why is there a don't do this? Because if you just if you could say, well, I only found the punishment in the Torah, but it didn't tell me not to do it. Would have said like the chinuch says. Some people will be like, okay, so I'll suffer the consequences. I've given the choice. It's my choice to sin. No, lichatchila, it's not really your choice. You have free choice in the extent that you will be held liable. You have agency. However, you've been told you can't do it. You can't blame God and say, well, you shouldn't have given me free choice in this matter. You shouldn't have given me the temptation. You should have made me the way I am, whatever it is. It's not yours to choose. You have to choose right. And he says, you have to choose to do that which is right and good. Oh, okay. Let's see here. Yeah, let's move on. Let's say one slaughters these sacrificial foods and also burns them outside the temple. So he's hit with two punishments, two liabilities. One for the slaughter, and another for actually processing this korban. Let's say he slaughtered it within the temple courtyard and he burned it beyond the temple courtyard. So he will be liable for also burning it. I say just burning it. Why? The shechita was fine. The shechita was done in the right place. But then you decide to build an altar or some other place, a pile of wood, just beyond the temple courtyard. Where was it? I don't know, Ezras Nashim, or somewhere in the Chil, somewhere else in Har Bayis even. So he is to be held liable for that. Let's say he slaughters it outside the temple and then brings it in, but put it on the altar. So he is to be held accountable, liable for this act of slaughter. By the way, it also invalidates the korbanot. He shouldn't be burning it either on the altar, but he's not going to be hit with another punishment of excision. And if he was unwitting, he's not going to have to bring a second korban to atone for this. Let's see here. Next halacha. Shachat b'chutz mechusar zman begufo. Let's say he slaughters beyond the temple. That's what b'chutz means. Saying that's mechusar zman begufo means it's too young. Okay. Hold on a second. Or babalim. I have over here babalim. Oh, babalim. In my edition over here in printed, it says oh babalim. Okay. Mechusar zman. So if you have an animal that's mechusar zman, that means it's technically too young, babalim, and if you say oh babalim, which I have over here, this means that for whatever reason the owner's not ready to bring it. Perhaps it's not his time yet to bring this korban. The owner's not old enough. Whatever it is, it's too early. Korban she'adayin lo hagia hazman be'alav lakrivo. I don't know why you answered that. Hold on 1 second. I think that there's something wrong here with the Machon Mamre. Oh no, I skipped something. Sorry. Okay. See, I'm not paying attention well enough. I skipped this halacha. Okay. I was reading what you see here on the text. I'm wondering why I'm reading the next halacha. Okay. Shachat b'chutz mechuzar zman begufo. If it's the animal's not ready yet. Okay. The animal's not ready. Oh, babelim. We're going to explain what that is in the next halacha. Because this animal should not be brought to the courtyard yet. It's too young. Patur. So his act of sacrifice beyond, or his act of ritual slaughter beyond the courtyard, he's not going to be hit with a liability here. He's patur from kareth or from having to bring a korban to shogeg. So let's explain what's an animal that's not ready to be offered. It's within its first 7 days. Remember, an animal can only be offered for sacrifice once it's 8 days old, just like a child can only be circumcised once he's 8 days old. Or you have pigeons, okay? Not turtle doves. We're talking about pigeons here. They're still too young. Remember, the pigeons, in order to be sacrificed, have to get to a certain maturity. You see the changing of the color of their feathers. There's no actual time. You don't say, well, this pigeon was born, unlike, let's say, a goat or a lamb. You have to keep track of its birthday, so you know when it's already out of its first year. Now it's in the second year. There's a halachic nafkamina for that. For this particular pigeon, you don't have to mark its birthday. You just have to know when it shows the signs of maturity. Or there's a prohibition of slaughtering an animal and its young on the same day. And by the way, that applies also to the animal and it's one of its parents on the same day, because that would be the same thing, just in reverse. Okay? And an animal it's young, or an animal it's child, because that's to the animal it's child, it's the animal it's young. Okay, so one of them was offered today, so now the other one cannot be offered. You have to wait until tomorrow to sacrifice it. This second one, whichever one wasn't offered, the parent or the child, is only going to be fit tomorrow. So these are examples that the Rambam gives of saying it's called mechusar zman begufo. What about the balim? Mezu mechusar zman babalim. What do you call a person who's not ready yet? Korban shadayin lo hagia zman be'alav lakrivo. It's not time for the person to bring this sacrifice. And by the way, for this halacha, there's also animals that are beyond their prime. They're too much time. It says that they got too old. The Korban Pesach that 3 days ago was in its first year, but now it's had its birthday, so now it's not valid anymore for Korban Pesach. So that's not a mechusar zman. That means it's beyond its zman. Animals also get too old. There's a specific psul. It's not a moon, but it's a psul. An animal that's already old and shaky, okay, is not fit for sacrifice. So he gives an example. So you have a zav and a Zav. A Zav is a guy with basically gonorrheal admissions. So he's almost as tamei as, let's say, a dead person. He has 70 tuma, and he has a whole ritual to remove this type of tuma, and he has a unique form of Torah. A tamei mace has to be sprinkled with the ash of the paraduma. The Zav has to go dunk himself in a spring. Everybody else can go to a spring also instead of a mikvah, but they're not required to. The Zav actually has to go to a flowing spring. Where do you have those? You could ask there. They exist here in Eretz Yisrael. So he's in a quite bad situation, and he can only bring a sacrifice once he's fulfilled a number of criteria and also counted a number of days. So too the Zava, that's a woman who's had discharges not in her proper time to get her period, and the Yoledeth, that's a woman who's given birth. No sinna, by the way. That's just these are mostly, at least the Yoledeth is natural. Hopefully, no one's ever a Zav or a Zava. If you have a man who's a Zav, it means he's got to get himself some medical help also. And a Zava, sometimes it's just caused by emotional problems, stress, hormonal types of things. So it's not necessarily needs medical attention. And Yoledeth, that's just that's a necessary part of life. So shachatu chatatam b'toch yemei svira b'chutz b'toch yemei svira. They slaughtered their sin offerings. All of them have to bring this type of sin offering, even if they didn't do any sin. That's part of their, in this case, the chatat with the tet, the dot and the tet, meaning more of a purification offering. So they offered these sacrifices outside the temple courtyard, but also before they had finished counting their 7 clean days, Keturin, so they're exempt for this wrong act of slaughtering this purification offering outside the temple. So too a mitzorah, a person who had one of the skin afflictions, not necessarily leprosy, and also he's like a zav. He's very contaminated. He has a specific ritual that decontaminates him, and he also has to bring sacrifice. So he brings these 2 korbanot. He has to bring this purification offering and his guilt offering, but he happened to have brought it before he was supposed to, but he did it outside the temple. So he's also not liable. He's not going to be punished or asked to bring a korban to atone for this. He has to bring a chatas to atone for the chatas that was brought wrong. Why? Because he did it beyond the temple. Shadayin lo niru ba'alei korbanot elu l'chapara. All these examples that we gave, the zav, the zava, yoledeth, and the mitzorah, weren't fit for atonement. Their time for bringing sacrifice didn't come. So the fact that they brought the sacrifice, they brought it too early, but it's mitigated by the fact that they brought it to the wrong place. Okay. Let's say they offered their burnt offerings. They also have to bring burnt offerings. Once again, beyond the temple courtyard, within their counts, their 7 clean days, chayavim, they are held liable. Why? Sholah doronhi. This olah is a gift to God. They're not necessarily like the chatat and the asham, which are ikar kapara. Chatat and asham cleanse. Remember, kapara is an atonement. There's quite a few words to purify something. There's tara, kapara. That's another time. It means to scour, literally. The chatat. Those are what purify these people. The burnt offering that they also have to bring. Remember, you have, let's say, a Nazir also has a whole slew of korbanot he has to bring. This is a gift to God. Doron is, I think it's from the Latin meaning gift. In Hebrew, it's forms of matan, usually the shorish nun, taf, nun. And in many cases, the nuns fall off. So matat, like in Matisyahu, that means gift of God. It's like Netanel, Netanyahu, El Natan, and Yonatan all mean the same thing. And in Greek, they call it Mattathias. And in Latin, it's been Latinized to Matthew. And then you have Doron, means also gift. That's basically Matan in Latin. So you had Jews with names like Theodorus or Theodosius, Todos, Todros. They're all variations of this type of name, gift of God. Thaddeus, they're all the same. There's different evolutions of one name. So people think that Doron, because it's mentioned by Chazal, they think it's a native Hebrew word, but it's not. It would be properly gift, even though you probably know, if you've been living in Israel long enough, you probably know there's 1 or 2 guys with the name Doron also. Just like what other name came back? Nimrod, Canaan. There's some other quite funny Hebrew names that people don't realize. Either it's not Jewish or even not necessarily the type of names you want to give to people. Okay. Let's see also here. Next off, let's make sure we're on the right place here. Nazir brings his sin offering. In this case, we saw before, it's his purification offering. He offered it while he's still a Nazir, before he completed his term, but he did it bachutz, beyond the temple courtyard. He is also exempt from punishment. But if he brought his burnt offering or his peace offering, the one he's going to be eating, when he completes his nizirut, he is to be held liable, even though he was held liable for the fact that he offered it beyond the temple courtyard, even though it's earlier than he's supposed to be bringing it. He has another 2 days to be a Nazir. Why? The chatat is what's stopping him. The chatat is what's going to allow, once he offers this, that's going to allow him to, like it says in the Torah, drink wine and also get a haircut, and also, I guess, now to be contaminated to the dead. It's not like he's running. I'm sure if you had a Nazir, what does he do? He completed his Nazirut. Part of the process is he shaves his head. So he's not going to be running to the barber. He has no hair left when he leaves the temple. And if he wants to drink wine, yeah, maybe it says that's something he might want to do. It's enjoyable. He'll be able to keep the mitzvah of Kiddush, for example. Until now, he's been having to listen to other people say Kiddush and Havdalah. Or if he's alone, he's been having to say it over bread at night. And he's saying Havdalah on, I don't know, whiskey or beer, or whatever it is. And he's not running to the cemetery. So the chatat is what's holding him back from drinking wine. And once it's offered, then he could drink it. And that's the Ikar Nazirut, okay, that he doesn't drink wine. And Nazir, I guess it's the fact that he grows his hair and doesn't go near the dead. Those are actually, I guess, marginal forms of Nazirut. Why? He's called, because that's the one that actually affects his behavior. His crown is his hair. And he's holier, so he doesn't go near the dead. But the fact that he is separating himself from this world, resisting wine, that's what really will help him. By maintaining sobriety, we keep ourselves away from sin. Remember, like the Mishneh, like the Beis Yosef says, regarding drunkenness on Purim, it cannot be you're allowed to get drunk on Purim. That's the gateway to all the other sins. Yeah. Asham Tolui v'chatara of aba'al safek. Here you have an Asham Tolui. We said this is dependent on Asham, which means, well, he doesn't know if he sinned yet, so he's bringing this Asham to play it safe. Chatara of aba'al safek, or a chatas of that also he's bringing only at a safek. We said he doesn't know if he is actually chayav to bring this chatas of. Safek let us safek zava. What is the case here? A woman doesn't know. She had some sort of discharge. She maybe miscarried, maybe she didn't. If a woman, chas v'shalom, has miscarries well into her pregnancy, she still has to bring the offering of a woman who is given birth. And that's kind of difficult. Sometimes she doesn't know. Did she actually give birth or just have a really weird period, whatever it may be? So these are done al safek. And if they did these types of things, they did them beyond the temple. They brought them as korban outside the temple. So they're also exempt from punishment. Charelo nikba isur. It's not known if they actually violated or became obligated to bring these chataot to begin with. So because there was no certain obligation to bring them, the fact they brought these korbanot outside the temple courtyard, also mitigating circumstances, so they're not considered liable for such a thing. They will not be hit with kareth if they were willing to do this, or they won't have to bring a chatat kvuah. Oh, we're going to see an interesting rava that's really coming up here. It's a great one. Okay, very complicated actually. So let's look into it. Hold on a second. I have to make sure I'm on the right place. They misnumber these things. Over here, what we're reading is Asham Talui. Okay, it's halacha yud. We're going to see that Rava disagrees majorly. So he says they're patur over here. He continues, Asham Itzura shekato b'chutz. You have the Asham Itzura. It was also it was slaughtered outside the temple. Shelo lishmo chayav. But it wasn't done for the right name. If it was done not for the right name, what does it mean not for the right name? It wasn't meant for an asham. We saw before in Maaseh HaKorbanot that whenever he offers a sacrifice, he has to have certain things in mind. That it's meant for God, it's meant for Reach Ticholach, meant for the burnt offerings, and also the name of the right korban. So there's an asham mitzorah. The mitzorah brings an asham, and he slaughtered outside, but it wasn't lishmo. So now he's chayav. Why? He could have brought it inside, in the actual temple, and it would have been kosher, as we're going to see later. And the Rambam concludes this halacha with saying, "V'chol korban shu patur al shkiyatato b'chutz." Any korban for which a person is exempt, like we've just seen, for slaughtering it outside the temple, kachu patur al ha'elato. So if you were to offer it, also you'd actually burn it on the altar, bring it up on the altar, and burn whatever part she's burning. You'd also be patur. So let's read the Ravad over here. The Ravad majorly disagrees. We'll read the short version, then we'll go into. You know what? I want to find a way to put this online, this on the screen, maybe share it, because I have something underlined here in the Ravad where you can see why does he disagree with the Rambam so greatly. The short version, he says over here, where the Rambam says, hold on, patur? No, he's actually liable for such a thing. And if he brought this oath, here, Asham Talui v'chatat oath. Asham Talui brought bachutz, so now he has to actually bring a chatat to atone for what he just did. And if he brought this ofabal safek, chatat ofabal safek, he brought this bachutz, he's not supposed to be exempt. He's also now going to have to actually bring an Asham Talui. Now these words keep coming up again. It sounded kind of confusing, so let's try to keep it straight. Rambam says patur for both these acts, bring an ashad talui bachutz and a chatata of habal safek bachutz, completely exempt. And the Ravad says that he's liable, and each one of those will result in a different punishment. One will result in having to bring a chatat, and the other will result in having to bring an asham talui. So this is where I originally made that note. Perhaps the Ravad is a bigger genius than the Rambam, because we'll see that he reads the source material entirely differently. But for whatever reason, we're using the Rambam's code because the Rambam actually sat down and codified all this. I'll read you what the Ravad says. Avraham, lo yadati me'ayin hotzi zeh. I don't know what his source for this is, how he derived this. Can't figure it out. V'ani matzati b'tosefta dizvachim. An example. See, we're talking, what's authoritative? You look in Tosefta, it's explicit. What does it say? Chatata of habal safek. Oh, the case we're talking about. Chatata of habal safek means a bird sin offering that is brought because of a suffix. Okay. V'kriva bachutz chayavin aleh asham talui, and he brought it bachutz. He has to now bring an asham talui. That's the punishment, not patur. He has to bring an asham talui. Asham talui al ba'al safek. He has a asham talui. That's also that's why it's brought on because of a case of doubt. V'kro bachutz chayav alav patat. And if he did this type of thing, asham talui, bachutz brought bachutz, so he is not patur. He is obligated to bring a chatos. So he just brought an explicit tosefta, unlike what the Rambam's saying in this halach over here. Good question. And he continues with Chaye Roshi, Aval Pishin Zarabi Nai, Himitu Kenet. And even though this looks kind of strange, it's correct. I said 2 weeks ago, the Ravad says it quite a few times. Chaye Roshi, he's very surprised by Rambam's psak. He can't comprehend why he would make such a psak. The chatara of al safek inaru yolam mizbeach eladama al bisaralo. If you have a chatas of that's brought al safek, it's not fit for the mizbeach. Only its blood is brought on the altar. That means they squeeze out the blood. The kohen offers the sacrifice. What is a chatas of? None of it's really burned. He takes out the digestive tract, takes out the zefik, and the rest of that. That's basically put in the base of deshen, and the kohen is to eat the entire chatasov. The blood is squeezed out onto the altar, but the bird is entirely eaten. So there's nothing that's really burned on the fire. Okay, so even though it's not supposed to be offered on the fire, if it actually makes its way to the top of the altar, so it stays up there. That's a general halacha, but we saw that which makes it up onto the altar is not to be brought down. Shema lo yalada. Okay, so he's obligated to bring an asham talui. Why? Because she might not have given birth. We saw that. What's the safek that she's bringing this type of chatat? We don't know if she gave birth or not. Okay, so we don't know about this. He continues, "Aval asham talui yesh mimenu lemizbeach damo ve'murav." If you actually have to bring an asham talui, that this case over here, there's actually parts of it that are put on the mizbeach. Its blood is put on the mizbeach, and it's emurim. Those are the entrails. The meat is eaten by the kohanim, but the entrails are actually burned on the altar. And like I just said, the meat of this asham, this guilt offering, is eaten like all the other ones by the kohanim, of course. And therefore, it's like all the korbanot that are fit to be brought in the temple. And therefore, if he did it bachutz, he should be liable to a punishment. In this case, to bring a korban chatat, now it's a vadai. Okay, so it's a good question. I haven't seen a proper answer. I thought it was entirely satisfactory, but I'll read you what the Kesef Mishneh says. Teretz of the Kesef Mishneh, he brings it from Krisus, the 18th page, and he says that this Tosefta, which is explicitly against what the Rambam's saying, that the Ravad just quoted, that's Rabbi Meir's opinion. But the Chachamim say Patur. Elsewhere, the Chachamim disagree with Rabbi Meir. The Tosefta is Rabbi Meir. What does it say? The Radbaz has another thing to say here. It says the Ravad lo ra'a et habrisa hazo halevi shitat chachamim. The Ravid didn't find a brisa that has the Chachamim who disagree with the Rabbi Meir as brought by the Ravad. So it could be Ravad didn't have what the Rambam had in front of him. He just saw a stam, what we attribute to Rabbi Meir, he thought was the entire Chachamim. Okay, but that's the answer. So who we hold like? We had a discussion a few weeks ago. This idea, see them like this: the halacha is going to follow Beis Shammai, Beis Hillel Beis Shammai in the future, unlike Beis Hillel. The way the Rambam has it is the halacha is not going to follow the Rambam. The halacha is not going to follow the Ravad. The halacha is going to follow whatever the Sanhedrin says. Remember, you can't begin to build a temple without a governing body of Torah scholars that we call the Sanhedrin, who are present at the temple to decide all these matters. It's not that we're going to open up the Seder Kachim and start to decide these things and try to recreate this historically. Yeah, there are things that we have a positive tradition, things are unanimous. But when it comes to these questions, these disputes, and other ones that will certainly arise once we start putting these halachas into practice, it'll be decided by a Sanhedrin. That's the good way to go about it. That's what the Rambam says. That's what we read about in Parshas Shoftim. Okay, so that's an interesting Ravad. So we saw the Ravad disagrees, and we saw two defenses of the Rambam. 11th halacha. Shnei sirim yom kippurim shechatam bachutz. Oh boy, this is another one that's a real doozy. A little bit of background. What are the sirei yom kippurim? It says in Achremos again, going back to that parsha, what we read on Yom Kippur, says that the Kohen Gadol is supposed to take, or Aaron's supposed to take 2 goats, and he's supposed to draw lots on them. 1 goat is for God, and 1 goat is a scapegoat. It's going to be sent out. First, he's going to confess all the people's sins on this goat, and he is going to then send it away, so to speak, with the people's sins, and it's going to be thrown off a cliff, and that's it. And the other goat is going to remain sacrificial. So there's supposed to be a pair that it says a mitzvah that they should have a certain resemblance to each other. Rambam begins in Hilchot Avodas Yom Kippurim that we read every year. Right? Let's see here. I'll read it over here. It says here, a ram as a burnt offering. And it says over here, one is a chatas that's going to be burned. And why is he mentioned, by the way? It's a chatas, it's sin offering. Normally you have a he-goat as sin offering, it's burned. It's Yom Kippur. So this one will be burned. Yes, but there's another sin offering brought on Yom Kippur. The sin offering that's just a part of the musaf. Every musaf on the Muadim, there's a he-goat as a sin offering that's eaten by the Kohanim. Even though that one is brought on Yom Kippur, it's not eaten there then and there on Yom Kippur because it's forbidden to eat on Yom Kippur. It's eaten in the evening by the Kohanim on duty in the temple. Hold on 1 second. That's in my eye. It's eaten then and there. So now we know what we're talking about. We have these two goats. So one's going to be the scapegoat, and one's going to be a regular sacrifice. And this is important because there's actually two stages. First, they have to be consecrated. It comes from the money of the community. That means for the general temple fund of sacrifices, like all the other sacrifices. They're supposed to give machatzis a shekel every year, and that silver pays for the communal sacrifices. That's where it gets us from. Why? Why do we have to mention this? Well, normally the sacrifices come from the Sibur. The reason for mentioning this is that some of these sacrifices in Yom Kippur, it says the Kohen Gadol actually pays for it. There are certain things he pays for himself, just like he pays for his chavitin, also his daily meal offering, half in the morning, half in the afternoon. So that comes from his own pocket, his figurative pocket. Now, these two animals, they have a long ritual. Normally, what do? The Kohen Gadol takes the sacrificial animal, slaughters it, catches the blood, applies the blood properly, and continues with the sacrifice. But in this case, a confession is made. And even before the confession is made, he actually has to draw the lots. And drawing the lots is a critical part of the service. So the question is, I guess it's like Schrodinger's cat. You have these two animals. One will be a burnt offering. One's basically kachim. And the other one is going to be taken out of the courtyard and thrown off a cliff. And before the lots are drawn, you could say that they both have the status and they both don't have the status. Are they sacrificial entirely or not? And the one upon which the confession was recited is thrown out of the temple, but the one that's supposed to stay in the temple is supposed to stay in the temple. So perhaps that one that's supposed to stay in the temple, perhaps the one that's supposed to stay in the temple should not leave the temple. And if it's offered outside the temple, now we would hit with this type of prohibition that we've been discussing until this point. So let's read what the Rambam says over here. He says the point is, for some reason, both animals are slaughtered. Okay? Even the scapegoat that is not going to be undergoing slaughter; it's going to be thrown off a cliff alive. If it's before he recited his confession, hayav karet al shnehem. So the one who slaughtered, that says hitvada, means the Kohen Gadol confessed on them. Whoever slaughtered them is going to be held liable to excision for both of them. Because he has yet to recite the confession, it hasn't been decided yet which one is for God, the actual offering, and which one is the scapegoat to be thrown off the cliff. They're both fit to go before God in the courtyard for this act of confession. So it's a problem to slaughter either of them. But if it's after the confession, now one is for God, and the one upon which the confession was decided is the scapegoat that's being thrown away. Patur al mishtalem. So the scapegoat, the one upon which the confession was recited, if it is somehow slaughtered, it left the courtyard with the ish et, the designated escort, take it out to the desert. So whoever slaughtered it will be exempt from punishment. Because now it's not fit to go before God. It's not a sacrificial animal. It's actually meant to be taken out of the temple courtyard. So now this actually raises the question, and those who have been studying the Gemara over here, like the Ravad, he also disagrees, says it's a little bit inaccurate. And even if someone was unfamiliar with this, this is actually the beginning of a Gemara there in Yoma. It's discussed in Yoma and elsewhere in Zvachim. I think it's right at the beginning of the 13th parak. Yeah, it's in the 13th parak there. So let's say you didn't study this in depth. If you're just reading this for the first time, you'd realize, wait a minute. So why does it matter about the confession? Shouldn't it be when he draws the lots? Because first the Kohen Gadol draws the lots, and hopefully the one for God's lot, will show up in his right hand. Say this one is for God. He'll say the ineffable name, and this one is for Lazazel. At which point they've been designated. So this is even before the confession. This should be the cutoff point. If he were to, or someone were to slaughter both of these animals outside the courtyard before the drawing of the lots, that's when we could say, oh, either of them had the potential to be a sacrifice. They're both fit to go before God. So we could be hit with this prohibition of slaughter beyond the temple courtyard. But once he has drawn the lots, once he's designated one for Azazel, so that one should be exempt from this prohibition, at least the punishment. Not l'chachila, he still should not be slaughtering it beyond the temple courtyard. He shouldn't be slaughtering it, period. But he's not going to be hit with a liability for violating this particular commandment, because now that the lots have been drawn, this is designated as specifically not a korban. And I'll read you the short version of the Ravad over here. So the Ravid actually says that the cutoff point is therefore the drawing of the lots and not the confession. We'll read the Ravad on the inside, and then we'll offer a potential answer to this. But first, let's read the Mishneh, the Mishneh source. We'll do a paraphrase in English. It says, right in the Mishnah, that the Sa'ir Mishtaleach is not Ru'ui to go into the temple courtyard. Well, what do you mean? It starts off in the temple courtyard. Before this happened, it was an ordinary sacrificial animal waiting in the temple to be used. And then it was in the courtyard. Then it had its designation as, okay, this one's going to the Azazel. And now it's not considered Ru'ui. And the Bavli continues there in Kuf Yud Gimel, Amud Beis. There's a brisa that says it is Ru'ui, but not for Hashem. It's a perfectly cromulent animal, and just because a lot was drawn from it, but it said it's not for God. So what does that mean? It is Ru'ui before the lots, but afterwards it's no longer Ru'ui. And what about the confession? Okay, it is, even if once it's been designated for Azazel, it still has to stay in the courtyard until the Kohen Gadol is done with his confession. Okay, so the Gemara continues. So it'll stay in until after the confession. So it was this way before Agrella, so there's no Mishtaleach yet. The answer is, it's called Sa'ir Mishtaleach. It's the one that's sent out. If that's what defining it as not Ra'ui, it's not fit for God, it must be that it's already taken the confession. I guess this is the source where the Rambam is trying to say, the Rambam, the way he reads it. Now let's read the Ravad, why he's going to disagree with Rambam, why he says that no, the cutoff point, decide whether this animal is fit or not, is the drawing of the lots, which precedes the confession. He says, Amar Abraham, Ani shonet ba'braita. Okay, I review. Lishnot means to review Mishneh teachings. That's where the word Mishnah comes from. Shinun, Mishinan tam levanecha. You have to keep repeating it so you know it by heart. Once again, it's a brisa. By the way, Tosefta is entirely brisa. Everything in the Tosefta is a brisa, means the outtakes. So the Ravid's saying, look at this. I found a brisa that says, Ad Shilo Higriel. Okay, Alehem Chayav al Shnehem. By the way, that's brought in Yoma 62. He says the cutoff point where when these animals are both fit for God and therefore liable, they could potentially be used for this prohibition, is before the drawing of the lots and one's actually designated for Azazel. That's the cutoff point. Ufiresh Rav Chisda Ho'il Urim L'Sa'ir Hanas Sabachutz. Even though it's fitting, the Sa'ir that's going to be brought outside. Misha Higril Alehem Chayav Al Shem Al Shel Shem. Once he's drawn the lots, he is considered liable for slaughtering the one that was meant for God beyond the courtyard. That means he took the one that was meant for God, he slaughtered beyond the temple courtyard, so now he's to be punished. Fatur al Shel Azazel. But he'd be exempt if he slaughtered the one that was meant for Azazel, because now it's being designated. So this is a pretty clear source in Yoma that the dividing line between both can potentially be sacrifices, and only one is a potential sacrifice, is the ceremonial act of drawing the lots. Alma, afilu kodem shehit vada, must be that even before the Kohen uttered the confession upon the what do you call it? Upon the scapegoat, which is by the way, after he drew the lots. Before confession, but after drawing the lots, that's when we already have this distinction. But the one that has been designated for Azazel, even though there's no confession has been recited, he's already exempt if he were to accidentally slaughter it or wantonly slaughter it beyond the temple courtyard. So there you go. That's the Ravad's source. And don't forget, even though technically speaking, he has to keep the scapegoat in the temple courtyard a few more minutes so the Kohen can recite his confession on behalf of the entire people. It's still not fit to go to the entranceway of the tent of meeting, which means be slaughtered in the courtyard. We already saw that just a half an hour ago. That's an biblical expression. Fit for to go, and the petach ha'omed means fit for sacrifice within the temple courtyard. V'yem yuchad l'Hashem, and to be designated, I guess, holy to God, to be one of His sacrifices. Okay. Ella sheyeh ra'ui lizrika ulhak Torah. Okay. It means that, fit for the blood to be thrown on the altar, burned on the altar like any other sacrifices. Shnamar l'Hashem says for God. What does it mean? Sacrifices for God it means its blood is applied to the altar, and the parts are burned on the altar. The Chayi Roshi, once again, by the life of my head, the Ravid's, I guess this is his chorus or his refrain. Shemata Zvachim Hitahu. I guess that the way the Shakalatar goes in Zvachim, Kuf Yud Gimel, like we mentioned before, it must have tricked him. Shelo Yerad Lefit Risha V'Umtsa'a Meshubeshet. We read to you before already how the Rambam reads the discussion in Zvachim, and the Ravad says that apparently that's what misled Rambam. Rambam had taken into account this Tosefta, this Brisa, as brought, he says in Yoma, page 62, and understood that the cutoff line is the Hagrala, he wouldn't have been misled by what he read in Zvachim. But we do have the question there in Zvachim. It says, well, what about Vidui? There's Hagrala, but don't we still have to do Vidui? So you could say that the question was superfluous. We already established that this goat is not Lashem. Okay, so once the goat is not Lashem, it's not a sacrifice. The questioner in Zvachim was saying, it's not Lashem, it's not fit for a korban, but should I remove it from the temple? No, you shouldn't remove it from the temple, because we still have to let the Kohen Gadol recite his confession. But it doesn't mean that this animal can potentially still be slaughtered beyond the temple, and the slaughterer would be hit with the prohibition of sacrificing holy food beyond the temple. That's not what the Gemara was asking. So you see that I don't think it's, whatever. I'm not entitled to opinion in this matter, but I could understand why Rambam would read the Gemara in one way, and the Ravad would read the Gemara in a different way. Okay, was the question about confession there in Zvachim a critical question regarding to halacha, or just a technical question that, like the Ravad sees it? So once the animal is no longer fit to be a korban because it has been designated for Azazel, so maybe we should just remove it from the courtyard, the temple courtyard entirely. Okay, it's a good question. Once again, we late to be seen. The nafkamina would be that if we would have, God willing, a temple service, like Kohen Gadol performing this act of this act on Yom Kippur, the question would only arise if he had already drawn the lots, and now he has a scapegoat, and for whatever reason, before the Kohen Gadol was able to utter his confession, someone took that goat, or the Kohen Gadol took that goat itself, and then slaughtered it somewhere beyond the temple. The question is, so would that person be held liable or not? Well, according to the Rambam, he'd be held liable because this animal still has not been confessed upon, so it's not entirely the scapegoat. And the Rava would say, yeah, it's already been designated as scapegoat, now it's no longer sacrificial. So the person who, for whatever reason, offered it, sacrificed it beyond the temple, slaughtered it beyond the temple courtyard, would be exempt from any punishment. So the Ravad is, I guess, more lenient than the Rambam. So if a question like this were to ever come up, I don't think we'd have to open up a Mishneh Torah here and analyze the Talmudic sources of this major machlokas between Ravad and Rambam. The sages who were there at the time would be asked their opinion, and they would decide on this matter. Yeah, okay. So let's see. I still have time for some other halachas. If anybody has also any more to share on those relevant passages, Yoma 62, Zvachim 113, if I'm not mistaken. It's chapter 13 and 113, like the Ravad says. It's most appreciated. We'll look at this one. Hashochet shlamim bachutz. Someone who slaughters a peace offering beyond the temple courtyard. Kodem shi yipatachu means before it says dalto daichal, before the doors of the temple are actually open. That's what they do in the morning. The ceremonial act of opening the temple's doors. Yipatachu is masculine. Daltot is feminine. According to strict Hebrew grammar, it should be tipatahna. But even already we see in biblical Hebrew, Mishneh Hebrew, modern Hebrew, usually the feminine plural future tenses just don't exist. They're replaced by the masculine ones for whatever reason. I remember asking a Hebrew professor, I said, I understand that you're not going to say, instead of tishmorna, you say yishmeru. So there's two things that differentiate the masculine future tense from the feminine future tense in the plural. That is, in the masculine, the prefix is yud, and the feminine, the prefix is tough. And the suffix for the masculine is shuruk, u, and for the feminine, it's na, okay, nun hey. So there's two distinctions. So I understand that it's hard to remember to start the feminine plural future tense with the tough. They don't want to do that. They're thinking yipatchu, so to say tipatach, so that's a little bit harder. And the na part also is very unusual. Instead of the u, there's the na part. So I asked them, would it be easier at least to say the feminine part, because you're used to when you talk to female singulars in the, let's say, the first person, you use the tough at the beginning, okay? And also in the third person, he tishmor, at tishmeri. They both start with tough. So if you're talking to feminines, you should say at least she kodem she ti patechu, okay? At least to keep the tough part, because you know you're talking to, I guess you're talking either, it's the same thing for second person or third person. Why not at least the feminine beginning? I understand that it's hard to get the feminine ending in, but why not a feminine beginning? So it should be ti patechu. I don't know. That's what they do. So it's entirely masculine form. So he slaughtered his peace offering a little bit too early. What's it say here? So now they're missing an act. What's a ceremonial act? Well, they're supposed to open the temple doors. But if they do it afterwards, right? He's exempt from such a thing, because technically speaking, there was something lacking in this sacrificial act. The doors should have been opened, and he did it before the doors were opened, so he's not going to be held liable. But they are going to be fit for service, I guess, to be brought before God right after the temple doors were opened. Okay, so they weren't ru'i at this time. At the time that they actually got slaughtered, they were not yet ru'in. It's like Mechusar's man, like we saw earlier. But we said Mechusar's man over here says, this is Mechusar's man bigufo. In this case, it's not gufo, because the animals are totally fine. And it's not Mechusar's man babalim, the owners, because the owners have nothing to do with this. This is the Kohanim opening up the temple doors, which are supposed to do even before, for example, the tamid is offered that morning. Okay. Now, shochet a pesach b'chutz. Let's say someone were to offer korban pesach, slaughter it beyond the temple courtyard, and this is also the beginning. This is one of the first halachas Rambam describes. That's Rambam describes in Hilchot korban pesach, which we're going to see, God willing, in the coming weeks. Afilu b'shar yomot hashana. Even if it's done any other day of the year. Remember, korban pesach is half a day once a year, the afternoon of the 14th of Nisan. All the other korbanos have other days when they're brought. Sin offerings can be brought every day of the year, and also everything else. Every day of the year you can have it. But korban pesach is unique. It's only half of one day every single year. Even if he brought it on any other day, whether lishmo bein shaloshmo, where his intention was to make it a korban pesach, or let's say a shlamim, which is usually the thing closest to a korban pesach, if he did it b'chutz, he's liable. Why? Because a Pesach, any other day of the year, is basically a shlamim. It's a lamb shlamim, a peace offering that's meant to be eaten. So because it's not lacking in any way, in this case, Pesach, any other day, we're going to see other halachas, by the way, also. The money for korban Pesach, if it can't be used for korban Pesach, so it goes to a shlamim, etc. Many halachas that compare the two. So he is liable. He offered korban Pesach beyond the temple, even on the wrong day, even for the wrong intention. So he's the hit for sacrifice beyond the proper place. And the last halacha, talking about a pregnant animal, be'emat hulin. This is a non-sacrificial animal, at least not yet, and it's pregnant. She'ubara kodshem mizbeach, but its fetus has been dedicated to the altar. How do they do that? It means that the person said, "Here's my pregnant cow. Its calf will be a sacrifice." Okay, lamizbeach. So now we have an interesting mix over here. You have kulin and kachim. Asur lishkota tabachutz. So you cannot slaughter this pregnant cow beyond the temple. Why? Normally, people do, if they're slaughtering the cow for whatever reason to eat it, whatever is inside, the fetus can also be eaten. It's also technically kosher. It's called a ben pakua. And it itself does not require slaughter. V'im shachat ino loket. But if he did slaughter this pregnant cow, pregnant with something holy inside, beyond the temple, he's not to be lashed. Why? This is the first time Ram mentioned that. Sorry, not the first time, but the Rambam is now mentioning lashed. Why did he say they're chayav karis? Yeah, chayav karis means that if the court does not step in and give him this corporal punishment, then the based on Shomal will eventually give him excision. But it's better, technically speaking, that if he has violated this, he should be lashed. That way he could be saved from the punishment of excision. But in this case, he wouldn't be chayav karis or excision or have to bring a chatos. Why? Because this animal itself is not fit to go before Hashem. It itself is not a sacrifice. Even though it has kachim inside its womb, it itself is not kodashim. Last halach. Ganav viktish. What if a person stole someone else's animal and then dedicated it to the temple? Interesting. Could he even do such thing? So we then slaughtered it outside the temple courtyard. So he'd be liable. Wow, because it's like slaughtering kachim, sacrificial food, beyond the temple, and in which case he's held liable. You could have said, wait a minute, is it even his? Yeah, let's talk about that. When did the sages consider this stolen animal his? Normally, he steals an animal. It's not fully his. He even has to give it back to the owner. So he definitely can't do some sort of ritual act of sanctification of this animal. How did it become a korban to begin with? So when did they do this? How did the sages, what legal or halachic mechanism did they use that we can now say that, this person's doing something so bad, he's liable to excision? Misha shektisha. It's from when he actually dedicated it. Before it was sitting in his yard, he's stolen it. It wasn't his. And he should have given it back. But the second he decided now there's going to be a korban, he declared it. So that was, I guess, the shinui, the change. People are learning Bava Kama now. Sheshechata achar yeyush. Okay? And it's also, by the way, on condition, his act of dedicating it made it into korban, and now it's like he stole it. And the condition for this liability is shechata achar yush, and the slaughter actually happens once the owner has despaired. Why? Because we saw the Ghana for the Goslin only fully acquire it, even if it was unlawfully, and even if they still have an obligation to make restitution. It's only considered theirs once the original owners have despaired of getting back what was stolen from them. If this is this act of slaughter happened before the original owners despaired of getting their animal back, so then the animal is not considered holy. His act of dedication for sacrifice is not considered a dedication, and therefore, if he were to slaughter it beyond the temple, he would not be hit with this terrible crime of slaughtering sacrificial meat beyond the temple. Instead, he's just causing more damage to his victim, and now won't even have a way to make restitution with this living animal. Instead, he'll have to make some sort of monetary restitution. Okay, any questions? No? Okay, well, let's stop at that point. Wish everybody Shabbat Shalom. We left to see the rebuilding of the temple, restoration of the Davidic monarchy and the sacrificial service, and the destruction of Amalek speedily in our days. Shalom v'nitzachon.
We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. If you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.